What if the oldest map of the human nervous system wasn't drawn in a lab, but was actually built behind closed eyelids, 3,000 years before the first microscope existed? Imagine men sitting so still that their breath barely moved the air around them while they mapped out the inner workings of the human mind. Right now, a modern fMRI machine can track blood oxygen levels across 200 brain regions at the same time. But it took us decades and billions of dollars to build that technology. The Rishis built their instrument differently by using the only tool they always had available, which was the body itself. The data they brought back describes neural pathways that modern science is only just now starting to confirm. These men weren't just praying or dreaming. They were running the longest internal experiment in human history. Act 1. The lab was the body. To understand what the Rishis were actually doing, you have to drop the idea that science always requires expensive equipment. It really doesn't, because science only requires a method, a repeatable process, and a way to verify your results. The Rishis had all three of those things, and they ran their experiments inside a nervous system they had spent years learning how to quiet. The first step they took was sensory withdrawal, and I don't mean that metaphorically. They used decades of disciplined practice to reduce external stimulation until the noise floor of the body dropped low enough that subtle signals finally became readable. You can think of it like trying to hear a whisper in a construction zone, where you have to kill the noise first before you can hear anything at all. The Rishis killed the noise. What they were left with wasn't just silence, but a very specific signal. They found internal states that most people never notice, because we are usually too distracted to sit still long enough to feel them. The Rishis noticed these states, and then they wrote them down, debated the findings, and tested them over and over again. Every claim that entered their tradition had to clear three specific filters to be accepted. First, it had to align with what prior practitioners had already recorded in the past. Second, it had to survive logical debate. And these weren't just polite chats, because Vedic scholars were trained arguers who could dismantle a weak claim in seconds. Third, and this is the part that sounds most foreign to us today, it had to be verified through direct personal experience. You didn't take it on faith, you confirmed it yourself through the same internal practice. That isn't mysticism, it's a peer review process that just happens to use a different kind of instrument. Out of this tradition came the Nadi system, where ancient texts describe 72,000 channels running through the body. These were pathways of felt sensation that the Rishis mapped through attention alone. Modern anatomy doesn't find 72,000 distinct physical tubes, but it does find nerve bundles, autonomic plexuses, and fascial networks that overlap with what the Rishis described as primary and secondary channels. Three main channels anchor this whole system, and this is where the story stops being just an interesting history lesson and starts being uncomfortable for modern science. The overlap isn't loose or poetic, but is actually structural. It describes in pre-technological language exactly what the autonomic nervous system does. The real question isn't what they believed, but what they actually found. Act 2. The map they shouldn't have had. Think about the two channels the Rishis called Ida and Pingala. Ida runs along the left side of your spinal axis and is described as lunar, cooling, and receptive, while Pingala runs along the right side as a solar, heating, and activating force. One of these slows your entire system down, and the other drives it forward, which is why the Rishis created specific breathing techniques to shift dominance between them, depending on what state a practitioner needed to reach. If you read that description again but replace the ancient names with modern terms, Ida becomes the parasympathetic nervous system, and Pingala becomes the sympathetic nervous system. The functions are exactly the same because we are talking about rest and digest versus fight or flight. One side cools and restores your body, while the other heats and mobilizes your energy. The Rishis didn't have our modern anatomical vocabulary, but they clearly possessed the functional map, and they used that map to build a clinical practice centered on shifting between these two states whenever they wanted. The central channel, known as Sushumna, runs straight up the spinal axis and is described in traditional texts as dormant in most people. These ancient writings claim that awakening this channel is the ultimate goal of the entire practice, but in modern terms, they were actually describing the process of vagal regulation. This is how a trained nervous system stops bouncing between feeling threatened and shutting down, eventually developing the capacity to rest in what researcher Stephen Porges calls the ventral vagal state. This condition of alert calm is the sweet spot of human performance, and it is no coincidence that the spinal cord sits at the exact anatomical location, the Rishis, mapped for Sushumna. That kind of overlap doesn't happen by accident, and it suggests they were paying incredibly close attention to the same biological system for a very long time. Then we have Bhramari, which is often called the humming breath. To do this, you close your mouth and exhale slowly through your nose while producing a low, continuous hum. The Rishis specifically told people to use this to calm an agitated mind, reduce anxiety, and get the nervous system ready for deep meditation. For 3,000 years, this was just a technique passed from teacher to student without any kind of biochemical explanation to back it up. But now, we actually have the biochemistry to explain why it works. When you hum during a nasal exhalation, you create a specific kind of airflow in your nasal passages that dramatically increases the air exchange between your sinuses and your nasal cavity. Your sinuses are one of the main places where your body produces nitric oxide, which is a gas molecule that relaxes your blood vessel walls and lowers your blood pressure. This process pulls your autonomic nervous system toward that parasympathetic rest state we talked about earlier. Studies on simple humming show that nasal nitric oxide levels increase about 15 times over the baseline during the practice. The Rishis had no concept of nitric oxide and couldn't have described the sinus tissue producing it. Yet, they engineered the exact acoustic conditions needed to trigger its release for the precise physiological outcome they wanted. That isn't just a lucky guess. It looks a lot more like reverse engineering. The chakra system takes this idea even further by describing 7 major energy centers distributed along the spine and into the head. Each of these centers is traditionally associated with specific physical and psychological functions. If you strip away the religious iconography, the lotus petals, and the Sanskrit names, what you are actually looking at is a map of the major nerve clusters distributed along your central axis. For example, the solar plexus chakra sits right at the celiac ganglia, which is the dense nerve network that governs your gut feelings and your visceral stress response. The heart chakra is located at the cardiac plexus, the junction that regulates your heart rate and how much blood your heart pumps. If you ask anyone where they feel grief or love in their body, they always point to that exact spot. The throat chakra aligns with the cervical plexus, which is the nerve complex controlling how you speak and swallow. The Rishis linked this center to expression and truth-telling, and that maps perfectly onto our modern understanding of how the vagal pathways through your throat affect both your voice and your emotional state. Ajna, or the third eye, is located between the eyebrows and corresponds to the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for self-monitoring and observing your own thoughts. Finally, the crown chakra describes what brain scans now show in experienced meditators, which is a quieting of the chatter system in the brain that leads to feelings of ego dissolution. These aren't just loose poetic ideas, they are structural overlaps across multiple systems created by people who didn't even have access to basic dissection tools. This forces us to ask a question that is very hard to ignore. How did they get this map so right? Either this is the biggest coincidence in history, or disciplined internal attention turned out to be a legitimate way to observe how the nervous system actually functions. Act 3. What modern science is finally seeing. Science took a long time to catch up to these ancient observations. It wasn't until the 1990s that Stephen Porges published his polyvagal theory, which proposed that the vagus nerve does much more than just regulate the heart. He argued that it organizes the entire hierarchy of how humans respond to safety and threat through specific neural circuits. When practitioners of yoga and meditation read his work, they recognize the descriptions immediately because they had been working with that exact hierarchy for centuries under different names. The data from modern neuroimaging is now becoming hard to argue with. People who have been meditating for a long time show much higher heart rate variability, which is a direct measurement of how healthy and flexible their nervous system is. Their brains also show a reduced reaction to things that would normally cause fear or stress. The regions of the brain associated with attention and feeling your own internal state actually show physical thickening in people who have spent years doing exactly what the Rishis told them to do. Your brain physically changes its structure when you practice sitting still and paying attention to what is happening inside you. That isn't a metaphor or a spiritual promise. It is a biological fact called neuroplasticity. This is exactly what the Rishi tradition claimed about concentrated awareness all along, even if they didn't have the fancy terminology to describe it. What we are seeing today isn't a gap between Eastern philosophy and Western science closing up. It is actually a measurement gap. The Rishis had the data all along, but they just didn't have the mechanical instruments to express it in a language that took 3,000 years for us to develop. The human nervous system was always the laboratory, and the only thing we were missing was a way to take a picture of what those practitioners were already feeling. The Rishis didn't just write down scripture, they built a working system through generations of watching their own minds. And modern neuroscience keeps stumbling into their findings by accident. Every time a new study proves how breath changes the brain or how stillness calms the amygdala, the gap between these ancient maps and our modern measurements gets a lot harder to ignore. The real question isn't whether these teachers were right, but rather, what else they mapped out that we haven't built the right tools to measure yet. You should subscribe for more stories like this and make sure to share this video with anyone who still thinks meditation is just sitting around doing nothing.